Deputy Sarah Chen's radio crackled mid-transmission, her voice catching as she stared at the impossible scene below. "We found Ranger Marcus Whitehawk. He's alive, but you're not going to believe this." The rescue team wasn't looking at a mauling. They were witnessing a vigil. Chen's partner dropped his medical kit, the contents scattering across pine needles as 5 massive grizzly bears maintained perfect formation around the unconscious ranger. The largest bear, its face marked by an old scar, lifted its head and fixed amber eyes on the approaching humans with unmistakable intelligence. Paramedic Tom Rodriguez had pulled bodies from bear attacks for 15 years, had seen the aftermath of nature's fury. His hands trembled as he whispered into his radio, "The bears, they're protecting him. One's got its paw near his head like it's been keeping watch." "Get those tranq guns ready," Chen ordered, though her voice betrayed her hesitation. What force of nature turns predators into guardians? And how long had they been waiting for help to arrive? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Marcus Whitehawk had always believed the forest spoke to those willing to listen. At 34, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who understood both the beauty and danger of Glacier Ridge National Forest. His weathered hands bore the scars of a decade protecting Montana's wilderness, while his dark eyes held the patient wisdom his father, Thomas, had instilled before a logging accident claimed his life 15 years ago. The ranger station Marcus called home sat like a lonely sentinel among towering pines, its walls lined with his father's conservation awards and faded photographs of wildlife rescues. Every morning he'd touch the brass compass hanging from his neck, Thomas's last gift, and venture into the wilderness that had shaped 3 generations of Whitehawks. The solitude suited him, though neighbors in Pine Creek whispered about the young man who chose trees over people, who spoke more to ravens than humans. 20 miles down the mountain, Eleanor Patterson wiped coffee rings from the counter of Ellie's diner with the methodical precision of someone who'd done the same task for 30 years. At 72, her silver hair framed a face etched by grief but softened by stubborn hope. The diner's walls told the story of Pine Creek through decades of photographs, harvest festivals, high school graduations, and too many memorial services. Since losing her husband to cancer and her son to Afghanistan, Eleanor had channeled her abundant love into feeding a community that couldn't quite fill the hollow spaces in her heart. "That boy needs a good meal and some company," she'd tell anyone who'd listen, referring to Marcus. "Lord knows I've got too much love and nowhere to put it anymore." 3 stools down from Eleanor's usual perch sat Frank Morrison, whose 78 years had been carved by Vietnam jungles and decades of Montana winters. The retired veteran's gnarled hands wrapped around his coffee mug with the same intensity he'd once gripped his rifle. Frank had watched Pine Creek change, had seen young folks leave for cities while the old guard held their ground with decreasing numbers. "Back in my day, we knew the value of loyalty," Frank would grumble to Eleanor during their morning ritual. "These days, everything's disposable." Neither Eleanor nor Frank knew that 50 miles away, Dr. Richard Blackwood was packing research equipment into his SUV, driven by a 30-year-old wound that had never properly healed. The behavioral scientist's credentials impressed university boards, but his real motivation remained buried beneath academic pursuits. The night his father died screaming in a Montana forest while bears circled in the darkness. The morning Marcus failed to report back, these lives would collide with a force none of them anticipated. In a world where wildlife documentaries showed nature's savagery and news reports emphasized division, they were about to witness something that would challenge everything they thought they knew about the capacity for love across species lines. The forest had been waiting to tell its story. It just needed the right people to listen. The morning started like any other for Marcus Whitehawk. He checked his radio, filled his water bottle, and kissed the brass compass that had guided his father through decades of forest service. Reports of illegal trapping had been filtering in for weeks, poachers targeting the bear population during their late summer feeding frenzy. Marcus knew the signs: missing wildlife, disturbed undergrowth, and the kind of silence that settles over a forest when predators sense danger. The trail wound deeper into Glacier Ridge than Marcus usually ventured alone, but the tracks were fresh. Broken branches marked a path toward the restricted watershed area, where environmental protections should have kept human interference at bay. His boots crunched softly on pine needles as he followed the evidence, radio crackling with routine check-ins from other rangers patrolling safer sections of the forest. "Base, this is Whitehawk, following trap signs toward Bear Creek watershed. Should be back by 1500 hours, he reported, adjusting the heavy pack containing his emergency medical kit and documentation camera. The response crackled through static. "Copy that, Marcus. Weather's holding steady. Keep us posted." What Marcus found made his stomach turn. A sophisticated snare system had been constructed in a natural clearing designed not just to catch bears but to hold them alive, the kind of setup that suggested trafficking rather than hunting. Scattered around the area lay evidence of recent activity: cigarette butts, energy bar wrappers, and the unmistakable stench of fear and blood. As he photographed the illegal traps, documenting GPS coordinates for the eventual prosecution, Marcus failed to notice the carefully concealed pit beneath a layer of branches and pine needles. The poachers had learned from their mistakes, creating backup traps for anyone who might discover their operation. The ground gave way with a sickening crack. Marcus plummeted 8 feet into a hand-dug pit, his ankle twisting at an impossible angle as he struck the rocky bottom. His radio flew from his belt, shattering against the stone walls as his head connected with a jutting boulder. The last thing he remembered was the metallic taste of blood and the distant sound of his father's compass chiming against the rocks. 18 hours passed in merciful unconsciousness. When the first grizzly appeared at the edge of the pit, natural law suggested Marcus's story should have ended there. Instead, something extraordinary began. The bear was massive, its dark fur silvered with age, but it was the distinctive scar running from its left ear to its snout that would later identify it to wildlife officials. The animal approached the pit with cautious intelligence, sniffing the air and examining the unconscious human below with what could only be described as concern. Rather than viewing Marcus as prey, the scarred grizzly began a vigil. Through the long Montana night, as temperatures dropped and predators stirred in the darkness, the bear maintained its watch. When coyotes ventured too close, drawn by the scent of blood, the grizzly's warning growls sent them fleeing. When a mountain lion appeared at the forest edge, the bear rose to its full 8-foot height, making its protective intentions clear. By dawn, the grizzly was no longer alone. A smaller female with 2 half-grown cubs had joined the watch, creating a defensive perimeter around the pit that no scavenger dared breach. The animals showed no signs of agitation or hunger-driven aggression. Instead, they demonstrated behavior that wildlife experts would later struggle to categorize: complex social cooperation in service of protecting another species. The search for Marcus began when he failed to check in for his scheduled radio contact. Deputy Sarah Chen led the initial ground team following his documented GPS trail toward the watershed. What they expected to find was either a lost ranger or, given the dangerous wildlife in the area, something much worse. What they discovered defied every protocol in the search and rescue manual. "Dear God," whispered paramedic Tom Rodriguez, as the team crested the ridge overlooking the clearing. Below them, Marcus lay motionless in the pit, while 5 grizzly bears maintained careful positions around the perimeter. The largest bear sat directly at the pit's edge, its massive paw extended toward the unconscious ranger as if offering comfort. Chen's radio trembled in her hand as she made the call that would change everything. "We found Ranger Marcus Whitehawk. He's alive, but you're not going to believe this. We need wildlife management, medical support, and probably a psychiatrist, because what I'm seeing isn't possible." The bears showed no fear of the approaching humans, but neither did they retreat. Instead, the scarred grizzly fixed its amber eyes on the rescue team with unmistakable intelligence, as if evaluating their intentions. Its message was clear: approach with respect, or not at all. In that moment, as cell phone cameras began recording and radios crackled with disbelief, a small Montana rescue operation became the spark for a global conversation about the nature of love, loyalty, and the mysterious bonds that connect all living things. The helicopter blades had barely stopped spinning when the video hit social media. Deputy Chen's body cam footage, initially intended for official documentation, somehow found its way to YouTube within hours of Marcus's rescue. The title, "Wild Grizzly Bears Protect Unconscious Ranger, Real Footage," garnered 50,000 views before Chen even finished her incident report. Eleanor Patterson was refilling Frank Morrison's coffee when her granddaughter called from Seattle, breathless with excitement. "Grandma, are you seeing this? There's a video of bears protecting some ranger in Montana, and it looks like your little town." Eleanor squinted at the smartphone screen Frank reluctantly held up, her weathered fingers adjusting her reading glasses. The footage was grainy but unmistakable. Massive grizzlies maintaining a protective circle around an unconscious man. When the camera zoomed in on the scarred bear's face, Eleanor gasped. "That's the Whitehawk boy," she whispered. Thomas's son. Frank leaned forward, his military bearing straightening with recognition. "I'll be damned. That bear's got more character than most people I served with." His gravelly voice carried across the diner, drawing curious glances from the handful of morning customers. By noon, the hashtag #Scar and Marcus was trending nationally. News vans began arriving in Pine Creek like metal vultures, their satellite dishes disrupting the peaceful mountain town's rhythm. Eleanor found herself fielding calls from reporters wanting local color, while Frank grumbled about "damn fool city folks" cluttering his favorite booth. The overnight sensation caught the attention of Dr. Richard Blackwood, who was reviewing behavioral data in his Missoula laboratory when a colleague forwarded him the viral video. Blackwood's academic interest was immediately piqued, and something deeper, something he'd spent 30 years trying to bury, began stirring in his chest. "Anomalous protective behavior in apex predators," he muttered, already composing research proposals in his mind. But as he watched the scarred grizzly's careful positioning around the unconscious ranger, older memories surfaced. The sound of his father's screams, the smell of pine needles soaked with blood, and his own 6-year-old voice crying for help that came too late. Blackwood made 3 phone calls. The first was to the Montana Wildlife Authority, requesting immediate access to study the behaviorally aberrant bear. The second was to his research assistant, ordering equipment for what he termed emergency intervention protocols. The third call, made after watching the video for the 7th time, was to a private security firm that specialized in wildlife management. Meanwhile, Marcus was fighting his own battles in the regional hospital. The head injury had left him with persistent headaches, but it was the psychological evaluation that truly concerned him. "Doctor." Sarah Martinez, the staff psychiatrist, seemed convinced that Marcus had hallucinated the protective bears, a trauma response to near-death experience. "It's not uncommon for isolated individuals to anthropomorphize wildlife," Dr. Martinez explained gently. "Your brain was protecting itself by creating a narrative of rescue rather than accepting the randomness of survival." Marcus stared at the ceiling tiles, counting the small holes while she spoke. He could still feel the warmth of fur against his skin, could remember the distinctive huffing sound the scarred bear made when settling down for the night watch. These weren't hallucinations. They were memories burned into his consciousness with crystalline clarity. "I know what I experienced," he said quietly, "and I'm going back." Dr. Martinez made a note in her file. "Mr. Whitehawk, I'm recommending a minimum 2-week psychological evaluation before you return to active duty." "This kind of trauma can be healing instead of harmful," Marcus interrupted, thinking of his father's journal entries about the therapeutic power of wilderness connection. "Sometimes the forest gives us exactly what we need, even when we don't understand it." Against medical advice and department protocol, Marcus checked himself out of the hospital after 3 days. The bruises were still purple across his ribs, and his ankle required a walking boot, but his need to return to the forest overwhelmed every rational consideration. The media circus in Pine Creek had grown exponentially. Eleanor's diner was packed with journalists, wildlife enthusiasts, and curious tourists, all hoping to catch a glimpse of the miracle ranger or his protective bears. Eleanor moved between tables with practiced efficiency, serving coffee and deflecting invasive questions with polite but firm redirections. "That boy's been through enough without y'all treating him like a sideshow," she told a particularly persistent reporter from CNN. "Maybe try showing some respect for what you don't understand instead of trying to explain it away." Frank had appointed himself unofficial bouncer, his veteran stare enough to discourage the pushiest media representatives. "In my day, we called this loyalty," he announced to anyone within earshot. "That bear's showing more honor than most politicians I've met." When Marcus finally returned to Pine Creek, driving his father's old pickup truck with careful deliberation, the town was barely recognizable. Satellite trucks lined Main Street, and clusters of people with expensive cameras wandered the forest perimeter, hoping for wildlife encounters. But it was the man in the pristine khaki field clothes who concerned Marcus most. Dr. Richard Blackwood introduced himself as a behavioral scientist from the university, his credentials impressive and his interest in the anomalous bear behavior apparently genuine. Yet something in his pale blue eyes reminded Marcus of winter ice, beautiful but potentially deadly. "Mr. Whitehawk, I'd like to propose a partnership," Blackwood said, extending a manicured hand. "Your experience represents a unique research opportunity. With proper documentation and scientific methodology, we could learn incredible things about wildlife cognition and interspecies communication." Marcus shook the offered hand, noting its softness, the hand of someone who studied nature from a distance, rather than living within it. "What kind of partnership?" "Controlled observation. We establish monitoring equipment, document future interactions, and publish our findings. There's significant grant funding available for this type of research. You could even receive compensation for your cooperation." The offer was tempting, especially given Marcus's mounting medical bills and the uncertainty surrounding his employment status. But something about Blackwood's intensity, the way his eyes lingered on Marcus's healing injuries, triggered an instinctive wariness. "I'll consider it," Marcus replied diplomatically, though every fiber of his being was already screaming warnings his conscious mind couldn't yet interpret. That night, Marcus returned to the forest alone. Marcus's first return to the forest felt like coming home and entering a cathedral simultaneously. The media circus faded behind him as he followed familiar trails deeper into Glacier Ridge, his walking boot making uneven impressions in the soft earth. The brass compass around his neck caught occasional shafts of sunlight filtering through the canopy, and for the first time since the accident, he felt his breathing settle into the natural rhythm of the wilderness. He found Scar near the creek where the rescue had taken place, the massive grizzly's distinctive profile unmistakable against the afternoon shadows. When Marcus approached, the bear turned with what seemed like recognition, amber eyes meeting his with an intelligence that made academic explanations feel inadequate. Marcus knelt slowly, ignoring the protest from his healing ankle, and placed his father's compass on a flat boulder between them. The brass gleamed against gray stone like an offering in an ancient ritual. Scar approached with careful deliberation, sniffed the compass thoroughly, then retreated to gather something from the forest floor, a perfectly formed pine cone which he placed beside the compass with surprising gentleness. "So we understand each other," Marcus whispered, tears blurring his vision. This wasn't coincidence or trained behavior. This was communication, respect, and something deeper that his father might have called the sacred connection between all living things. The ritual became daily practice. Each morning, Marcus would hike to what locals began calling Scar's Clearing, where he'd leave small tokens, smooth river stones, interesting branches, or wildflowers, while Scar reciprocated with his own forest gifts. Word spread through Pine Creek's tight-knit community, and soon Eleanor and Frank were making regular pilgrimages to witness what they considered nothing short of miraculous. "Honey, I've buried a husband and a son," Eleanor told Marcus one evening as she insisted on packing him sandwiches for his forest visits. "I know what real love looks like, and that bear's got it in spades. Don't let anyone tell you different." Frank was characteristically blunt in his assessment. "That bear shows more loyalty than half the platoon I served with in Nam. You got yourself a friend for life, son. That's worth more than all the scientific explanations in the world." But the scientific community had other ideas. Dr. Richard Blackwood's arrival in Pine Creek coincided with a systematic campaign to study, document, and ultimately control what he termed dangerous anthropomorphization of apex predators. His university credentials opened doors with county officials, and his carefully worded reports to the Montana Wildlife Authority emphasized public safety concerns over the remarkable nature of the human-bear bond. "The subject animal displays aberrant behavior patterns that could indicate neurological damage or disease," Blackwood wrote in his preliminary assessment. "Immediate intervention is recommended to prevent potential escalation of dangerous encounters with civilian populations." Eleanor discovered Blackwood's true intentions when she overheard him on his phone outside the diner, speaking with someone about controlled capture protocols and behavioral modification procedures. Her grandmother's intuition, honed by decades of reading people, recognized the cold calculation in his voice. "Frank, we got trouble," she whispered, pulling the veteran aside. "That scientist isn't here to study anything. He's here to hurt that bear." Frank's military instincts activated immediately. "What did you hear?" "Enough to know he's planning something bad. We need to warn Marcus." But Marcus was already sensing the shifting atmosphere around his sanctuary. County officials had begun asking pointed questions about liability and public safety. State wildlife officers appeared on patrol routes they'd never monitored before. Most disturbing, someone had been placing motion-activated cameras throughout Scar's territory without authorization or notification. The breaking point came when Marcus discovered Blackwood attempting to dart Scar with a tranquilizer gun during one of their morning meetings. Marcus arrived just as Blackwood was taking aim from behind a cluster of pine trees. His academic facade dropped in favor of predatory focus. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Marcus shouted, his voice echoing across the clearing and causing Scar to retreat defensively. Blackwood lowered the tranquilizer rifle but didn't release his grip. "Conducting necessary research, Mr. Whitehawk. This animal exhibits dangerous behavioral anomalies that require immediate intervention." "Dangerous?" Marcus limped forward, putting himself between Blackwood and Scar. "The only dangerous thing I see here is someone trying to harm an animal that's shown nothing but protective instincts." "You don't understand the broader implications," Blackwood replied, his voice carrying an edge that suggested deeper motivations. "Bears that lose their natural fear of humans become unpredictable. They attack families, children. I've seen what happens when people romanticize these predators." Marcus studied Blackwood's pale eyes, noting the way they tracked Scar's movements with something approaching hatred. "This isn't about research, is it? This is personal." Blackwood's composed mask slipped for just a moment, revealing raw pain underneath. "My father died because people like you think bears are misunderstood creatures instead of killing machines. I won't let that happen to another family." The confrontation attracted attention from both the community and the media. Video footage of Marcus physically preventing Blackwood from tranquilizing Scar went viral within hours, sparking heated debates about wildlife management, scientific ethics, and the rights of animals displaying extraordinary behavior. Eleanor marshaled her considerable social influence to organize what she called Scar's Army, a grassroots coalition of locals, tourists, and social media supporters dedicated to protecting the remarkable bear. Her diner became unofficial headquarters for a movement that grew beyond anyone's expectations. "I've got arthritis in my hands and grief in my heart," Eleanor announced to a packed diner during an impromptu town meeting. "But I'll be damned if I let some bitter scientist destroy the most beautiful thing I've witnessed in 30 years. That bear chose love over instinct." "Maybe it's time we did the same." Frank leveraged his veteran networks to bring national attention to what he framed as a battle between authentic American values and academic overreach. His interviews on conservative talk shows struck a nerve with audiences hungry for stories about loyalty, honor, and the intrinsic worth of uncommon relationships. "Back in my day, we understood that some bonds transcend explanation," Frank told a national radio audience. "That bear's got more character in his left paw than most politicians have in their whole body. If we can't protect something that pure, what does that say about who we've become?" The economic impact on Pine Creek was immediate and significant. Tourism revenue surged as people traveled from across the country hoping to witness Scar and Marcus's daily meetings. Local businesses adapted quickly, with Scar-themed merchandise appearing in shop windows and restaurants offering bear protection burgers and Guardian Grizzly coffee. But the attention also brought unwanted scrutiny. Corporate interests, recognizing the economic potential of the story, began approaching Marcus with offers for book deals, documentary rights, and sponsored appearances. Logging companies, seeing opportunity in the media focus, renewed their applications for access to previously protected forest areas. Marcus found himself caught between competing pressures. His savings were depleted from medical bills and unpaid leave, making the financial offers increasingly tempting. His ranger position remained uncertain, with supervisors concerned about liability and his ability to maintain professional objectivity. Most troubling, Blackwood's influence with state wildlife authorities was growing, bringing the threat of official intervention closer each day. The crisis deepened when Blackwood filed formal complaints alleging that Marcus was interfering with legitimate scientific research and creating public safety hazards through wildlife habituation. The complaints triggered a 30-day evaluation period during which Scar's fate would be officially determined by a panel of wildlife experts, none of whom had witnessed the remarkable relationship firsthand. "They're going to kill him," Marcus told Eleanor one evening as she insisted on feeding him dinner, despite his protests. "They'll call it relocation, but we both know what happens to problem bears." Eleanor reached across the table and covered his hands with her own weathered fingers. "Honey, that bear didn't guard you for 18 hours just to give up now. And neither are we. Sometimes you have to fight for what matters, even when the odds seem impossible." Frank nodded grimly from his corner booth. "Son, I've seen what happens when good people do nothing while bureaucrats make decisions about things they don't understand. That bear's worth fighting for, and so are you." The battle lines were drawn, a small Montana community and their viral bear against institutional authority and scientific orthodoxy. The stakes couldn't be higher, not just for Scar's survival, but for the preservation of something extraordinary in a world increasingly skeptical of miracles. As the 30-day evaluation period began, Marcus realized he faced a choice that would define not only his future, but the very nature of human-wildlife relationships in an age of environmental crisis and social division. The compass around his neck seemed heavier with each passing day, carrying the weight of his father's legacy and the hope that love might prove stronger than fear. Day 29 of the evaluation period arrived with the weight of inevitability. The official hearing was scheduled for the following morning, and Marcus had spent sleepless nights knowing that bureaucratic decision-makers who had never witnessed Scar's gentle intelligence would determine his fate based on policy manuals and liability assessments. Dr. Richard Blackwood had orchestrated his final gambit with calculated precision. He'd convinced the Wildlife Authority panel that one last controlled observation was necessary to document Scar's behavior patterns before making their determination. What the panel didn't know was that Blackwood had no intention of merely observing. Eleanor sensed trouble when she saw Blackwood loading equipment into his SUV outside the Pine Creek Hotel. Her decades of reading people, drunk loggers, grieving widows, lying teenagers, had given her an intuition that rarely failed. The man's movements were too purposeful, his expression too focused for simple scientific observation. "Frank, something's not right," she told the veteran as they watched through the diner's front window. "That man's up to no good." Frank's military training kicked in as he noted the suspicious bulges in Blackwood's pack and the way he kept checking his watch. "Looks like he's planning an operation, not an observation. We better warn Marcus." But Marcus was already deep in the forest, drawn by a restlessness he couldn't explain. Scar had been agitated for days, pacing the clearing and sniffing the air with obvious concern. The bear's usual calm demeanor had been replaced by protective vigilance, as if sensing approaching danger through channels humans couldn't perceive. Blackwood hiked alone toward Scar's territory, carrying equipment he'd never mentioned in his official research proposals. The tranquilizer gun was standard issue, but the audio equipment was military grade, designed to broadcast recorded distress calls that would agitate any bear into aggressive behavior. His plan was elegant in its cruelty: provoke Scar into an attack, document the aggression, and justify immediate termination for public safety. The scarred Grizzly was feeding peacefully when the first distress call echoed through the forest. The sound was wrong, a recording of cubs in mortal danger that triggered every protective instinct evolution had programmed into adult bears. Scar's head snapped up, his massive frame tensing as the artificial cries continued from hidden speakers Blackwood had positioned throughout the clearing. Marcus heard the sounds from a quarter-mile away and recognized them immediately as unnatural. No bear cubs would cry with such perfectly timed intervals, and the acoustics suggested electronic amplification. He began running despite his healing ankle, crashing through underbrush with growing desperation as he realized what was happening. Blackwood emerged from his hiding position as Scar began searching frantically for the cubs he believed were in danger. The bear's agitation was obvious, exactly what Blackwood needed for his documentation. He raised the camera with one hand and the tranquilizer gun with the other, waiting for the perfect moment to capture aggressive behavior on film. "Looking for something?" Blackwood called out, his voice carrying 30 years of accumulated hatred. "Looking for cubs that don't exist. That's what your kind does. You follow sounds of pain and suffering, looking for opportunities to kill." Scar turned toward the human voice, confusion evident in his amber eyes. The bear had learned to associate human presence with safety and companionship, but this human emanated hostility that contradicted everything his experience had taught him. Marcus burst into the clearing just as Blackwood triggered another round of distress calls. "Stop this!" he shouted. But Blackwood had already raised the tranquilizer gun, aiming not at Scar but at the space between them. "Stay back, Whitehawk," Blackwood commanded, his academic composure finally cracking to reveal the damaged child underneath. "You're about to witness what really happens when people romanticize apex predators. This bear is going to show his true nature, and I'm going to document every second." Marcus stepped protectively in front of Scar, who had moved closer, seeking the familiar comfort of human companionship. "He's not aggressive, Richard. Can't you see that? Even with your recordings, even with your threats, he's trying to understand, not attack." "Richard?" Blackwood's eyes widened with surprise. "How do you know my—" The question died as recognition dawned. The bone structure, the dark eyes, the way Marcus held his left shoulder slightly higher than his right, all familiar from childhood memories he'd tried to bury. "You're Thomas Whitehawk's son," Blackwood whispered, the tranquilizer gun trembling in his hands. "You're my—" "Brother," Marcus finished quietly. "I wondered when you'd figure it out." The artificial distress calls continued their electronic crying, while two estranged brothers faced each other across a gulf of 30 years, an accumulated pain. Scar positioned himself protectively beside Marcus, his massive frame a living barrier between the man who had saved his life and the one who threatened it. Blackwood's carefully constructed narrative began crumbling as suppressed memories surfaced. He remembered an older boy who had tried to comfort him after the bear attack, remembered being pulled away by social workers, remembered screaming for the brother who couldn't save him from a system that separated traumatized children based on arbitrary assessments of family stability. "Dad tried to keep us together," Marcus said, reading the confusion in his brother's eyes. "But you were adopted before he could get custody. He never stopped looking for you, Richard. He kept a file with every lead, every dead end. He died hoping you'd come home." "Home?" Blackwood laughed bitterly, though tears were streaming down his face. "Home to what? To the place where bears killed our father? To the family that couldn't protect anyone?" "To the family that loved you," Marcus replied. "Dad didn't die because of bears, Richard. He died trying to save a bear that poachers had trapped. He died because he believed every life had value, even ones that most people would consider dangerous." The emotional revelation was interrupted by the arrival of Eleanor, Frank, and a growing crowd of supporters who had followed GPS coordinates from Marcus's emergency beacon. Cell phones began recording as the confrontation unfolded, documenting a moment that would reshape public understanding of both human and animal nature. Eleanor took in the scene with her grandmother's wisdom. Two brothers in pain, a bear caught between protection and confusion, and a man with a gun who had clearly lost his way. She stepped forward with the fearless authority of someone who had buried too many loved ones to be intimidated by academic credentials or weapons. "Son, I don't know what hurt you so badly that you'd threaten an innocent animal," she said directly to Blackwood, "but I know hurt when I see it. That bear isn't your enemy. Your pain is." Frank positioned himself where his military experience suggested maximum tactical advantage while keeping his voice calm and non-threatening. "Dr. Blackwood, I've seen what revenge does to good men. It doesn't heal the wound, it just spreads the poison to everyone around you." The crowd continued growing as news of the confrontation spread through social media. Save Scar began trending again as live streams captured the standoff between a traumatized scientist and the bear he blamed for childhood trauma. The artificial distress calls continued their electronic manipulation, but Scar remained focused on Marcus, demonstrating the very loyalty and intelligence that made him extraordinary. Blackwood found himself surrounded by witnesses to a love that contradicted everything he'd believed about human-wildlife relationships. The bear he'd come to destroy was showing more emotional sophistication than many humans he'd known. The brother he'd lost was risking his life to protect an animal that most people would consider dangerous. The community he'd dismissed as naive was demonstrating a courage that humbled his academic achievements. The tranquilizer gun felt impossibly heavy in his hands, as 30 years of accumulated hatred met the reality of Scar's gentle nature. Everything he'd built his career on, the assumption that bears were mindless killing machines, that his father's death proved their inherent danger, was crumbling in the face of observable truth. The climax approached as Blackwood faced the choice that would define not only his future, but the fate of the remarkable relationship between Marcus and Scar. The forest held its breath, waiting for a decision that would determine whether love or fear would prevail in a world desperately needing examples of both healing and hope. The tranquilizer gun discharged with a hollow pop that echoed through the clearing like a death sentence. But Richard Blackwood's hands, trembling with 3 decades of suppressed grief and rage, had jerked at the crucial moment. The dart intended for Scar struck Marcus in the shoulder instead, sending him stumbling backward with a cry of shock and pain. Time seemed to fracture as the animal-grade sedative designed for an 800-pound grizzly flooded through Marcus's 180-pound frame. His knees buckled as the massive overdose attacked his nervous system with potentially lethal efficiency. Eleanor screamed from the crowd while Frank began shouting orders for medical evacuation, but the remote location meant help was 30 minutes away at minimum. Scar's reaction defied every principle of wildlife behavior that Blackwood had studied. Instead of fleeing from the gunshot or becoming aggressive in the chaos, the massive grizzly moved with heartbreaking gentleness toward the collapsing Marcus. With careful precision that seemed impossible for such powerful limbs, Scar positioned himself to catch Marcus as he fell, cushioning the ranger's body against his own massive frame. "No, no, no," Blackwood whispered, dropping the tranquilizer gun as he realized what he had done. The bear he had come to destroy was now cradling his unconscious brother like a parent protecting a child. Scar's amber eyes fixed on Blackwood with an expression that held no hatred, only profound sadness and what looked disturbingly like pity. Eleanor pushed through the crowd with the authority of someone who had nursed too many people through too many crises. "That drug will kill him," she said, her voice cutting through the panic with clinical precision. "At that dosage, it'll shut down his breathing. We need to get him to a hospital now." Frank was already on his radio, calling in every favor from his military network. "I need emergency medical evacuation at these coordinates. Ranger down, accidental drug overdose, critical condition." His voice carried the command authority of someone accustomed to life or death situations, but even he knew the numbers didn't look good. The helicopter couldn't land in the dense forest canopy, which meant carrying Marcus to the nearest clearing, a quarter-mile hike through rough terrain. Under normal circumstances, it would be difficult but manageable. With Scar maintaining protective vigil over the unconscious ranger, it became seemingly impossible. "We have to move him," Frank announced to the assembled crowd. "That bear's going to have to understand we're trying to help." But Scar's protective instincts had fully engaged. When the first rescuer approached, the grizzly shifted position to shield Marcus more completely, his massive bulk creating an impenetrable barrier. He wasn't aggressive, but his message was unmistakable. No one would reach Marcus without going through him first. Blackwood watched the scene unfold with growing horror. His quest for revenge had created exactly the tragedy he claimed to be preventing. Marcus was dying from an overdose intended for the bear that was now desperately trying to save him. The artificial distress calls continued their electronic crying, adding surreal soundtrack to a crisis that Blackwood's hatred had created. "He won't let us near him," one of the paramedics reported to Frank. "That bear sees us as threats to the ranger. We're going to need wildlife control to tranquilize the animal before we can reach the patient." "More tranquilizers?" Eleanor's voice cracked with exhaustion and disbelief. "Haven't we done enough damage with drugs and guns and people who think they know better than love itself?" The crowd fell silent as Scar began exhibiting behavior that none of them had ever witnessed. The massive bear was gently licking Marcus's face, his rough tongue careful around the ranger's closed eyes. When Marcus's breathing became labored, Scar adjusted his position to keep the airway clear. Most remarkably, the bear began a low, rhythmic humming that seemed to match Marcus's heartbeat, a sound that wildlife experts would later struggle to categorize. Dr. Martinez, the psychiatrist who had treated Marcus after his original accident, pushed through the crowd with medical equipment from the Pine Creek Clinic. "That bear is trying to keep him alive," she announced, her previous skepticism about human-animal bonds completely abandoned. "Look at the positioning, the way he's monitoring breathing." This is sophisticated medical intuition. Blackwood found himself caught between his scientific training and the emotional breakthrough that was shattering 30 years of carefully constructed hatred. Everything he had believed about bears, that they were mindless predators driven by hunger and aggression, was being disproven by an animal showing more compassion than he had displayed in decades. "I have to approach him," Blackwood said quietly, more to himself than the crowd. "This is my fault. If anyone can get close enough to help Marcus, it should be me." Eleanor gripped his arm with surprising strength. "Son, that bear doesn't know you from any other stranger. He just knows you're the one who hurt his boy. You step toward them, and he might decide you need to be stopped permanent-like." But Frank's military mind was already calculating probabilities. "Actually, he might be our best option. That bear's intelligent enough to distinguish between threat and help. If Blackwood approaches without weapons, showing submission, showing love," Eleanor corrected firmly. "That bear understands love, not submission. If you're going to help your brother, you better find some of the love your daddy tried to teach you before it's too late." Blackwood approached Scar and Marcus with empty hands and a heart breaking open for the first time in 30 years. Each step brought back memories he had spent decades suppressing. Marcus reading him bedtime stories, teaching him to tie shoes, promising they would always be brothers no matter what grown-ups decided. The 6-year-old boy who had been torn away from his family was finally coming home. Scar watched Blackwood's approach with careful assessment. The bear's nostrils flared as he scented the approaching human, perhaps recognizing something familiar in the genetic markers that linked the two brothers. When Blackwood knelt 10 feet away and extended his empty hands, Scar's massive head tilted with what looked like consideration. "I'm sorry," Blackwood whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was apologizing to Scar, to Marcus, or to the father whose memory he had dishonored with 30 years of hatred. "I'm so sorry for everything." Marcus's breathing became increasingly shallow as the overdose continued its assault on his nervous system. The crowd watched in horrified silence as the man who had become a symbol of human-wildlife harmony fought for his life, protected by the very animal his brother had tried to destroy. The helicopter's rotors grew louder in the distance, but everyone knew that time was running out. Marcus needed immediate medical intervention, and the only creature who could provide access was a grizzly bear whose trust had been shattered by the very family member who now begged for forgiveness. Eleanor began praying aloud, her voice carrying across the clearing with the authority of someone who had negotiated with the divine through decades of loss and hope. Frank stood at attention, his military bearing masking the emotional storm of watching a young man die in service to something beautiful and misunderstood. The artificial distress calls finally stopped as Blackwood's equipment battery died, leaving the forest in natural silence except for the approaching helicopter and Marcus's labored breathing. In that sudden quiet, Scar made a decision that would define the meaning of love, forgiveness, and the mysterious bonds that connect all living things. The massive bear looked directly into Blackwood's eyes with an expression that seemed to peer into his soul. Then, with movements as gentle as falling snow, Scar carefully shifted his position to create space beside Marcus's unconscious form. The invitation was clear: approach with love, not fear, and help save the life they both treasured. Blackwood crawled forward on hands and knees, tears streaming down his face as he reached his brother's side under the protective watch of the animal he had spent his career vilifying. Marcus's pulse was barely detectable, his breathing dangerously shallow. But he was still alive. There was still time for love to triumph over the hatred that had poisoned too many years and caused too much pain. The tragedy had reached its nadir, but redemption remained possible if courage could overcome fear, and forgiveness could heal the wounds that revenge had only deepened. The medical team worked with desperate efficiency as Scar maintained his vigil beside Marcus's unconscious form. Dr. Martinez administered emergency medications while the bear watched every movement with protective intensity, his massive presence somehow calming rather than threatening in the chaos of the rescue operation. Blackwood knelt opposite the medical team, his hands gently supporting his brother's head while tears carved clean paths through the dirt on his face. "His vitals are stabilizing," Dr. Martinez announced, after what felt like hours but had been only minutes. "The naloxone is counteracting the tranquilizer, but we need to get him to intensive care immediately." The helicopter evacuation proceeded under Scar's watchful supervision. The massive Grizzly followed the stretcher to the forest's edge, stopping only when the rotor wash became too intense. His final gesture before the aircraft lifted off was to place a pine cone beside the landing zone, a message Marcus would understand when he awakened. 3 days passed in the sterile uncertainty of the hospital's intensive care unit. Marcus drifted between consciousness and sedated sleep, while a nation held its breath, following updates through social media and news reports. The story had evolved beyond viral entertainment into something approaching spiritual pilgrimage, with people gathering in Pine Creek from across the country to witness what they couldn't quite name but desperately needed to believe in. Eleanor had effectively moved into the hospital, sleeping in waiting room chairs and coordinating the overwhelming support pouring in from strangers who felt personally invested in Marcus's recovery. Frank stood guard against intrusive media while fielding calls from politicians, celebrities, and religious leaders who wanted to attach themselves to the story's growing cultural significance. Blackwood never left his brother's bedside. The academic who had built his career on emotional detachment now poured 30 years of suppressed love into whispered conversations with an unconscious sibling. He spoke about their father's journals, which Eleanor had brought from Thomas Whitehawk's storage unit, volumes filled with guilt about losing Richard and desperate hope for eventual reunion. "Dad never stopped looking for you," Marcus had whispered during one of his brief conscious moments. "Every birthday, every Christmas, he'd light a candle and wonder if you were safe, if you were happy, if you remembered that you had a brother who loved you." The journals revealed truths that shattered Blackwood's carefully constructed narrative about his family's abandonment. Thomas Whitehawk had fought the adoption system for years, spending his life savings on legal fees and private investigators. The bear attack that killed Richard's adoptive father had been mentioned in local newspapers. Thomas had read about it and tried to reach his younger son, only to be blocked by well-meaning social workers who believed contact would traumatize the grieving child further. "I thought he gave up on me," Blackwood confessed to his unconscious brother. "I thought the bears were more important than his sons. But he saved that cub, the one that became Scar, because he couldn't save me." He was trying to honor the connection we lost. Eleanor found the letter on the fourth day, tucked inside Thomas's compass case like a message waiting for the right moment to surface. The envelope was addressed to "My Sons" in Thomas's careful handwriting, dated just weeks before his death in the logging accident. "Boys," the letter began, "if you're reading this together, then the good Lord has answered my greatest prayer. Richard, I know you're angry about being separated, and Marcus, I know you blame yourself for not protecting your little brother. But family isn't about perfect protection. It's about perfect love, even when circumstances try to break the bonds that matter most." The letter continued with Thomas's hope that his sons would find each other and his belief that love could heal wounds that time alone couldn't touch. "The forest taught me that survival isn't about being the strongest or the smartest. It's about recognizing the connections that sustain life itself. You boys are connected by more than blood. You're connected by the capacity to see value in creatures that others might fear or misunderstand." Marcus stirred as Eleanor read the letter aloud, his eyes focusing first on his brother's tear-streaked face and then on the brass compass gleaming in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the hospital window. "Richard?" Marcus's voice was hoarse but alert. "You stayed." "I'm never leaving you again," Blackwood replied, gripping his brother's hand with desperate intensity. "I've wasted 30 years hating the wrong things, blaming animals for human failures, building walls instead of bridges. I'm done with revenge. I want to learn about love." The reunion was interrupted by urgent knocking on the hospital door. Frank entered with uncharacteristic urgency, his face grim despite the positive news of Marcus's recovery. "We've got problems back home," Frank announced. "The State Wildlife Authority used the shooting incident to justify immediate action against Scar. They've got a capture team in the forest right now claiming public safety emergency." Eleanor's face hardened with determination that would have impressed generals and intimidated politicians. "Over my dead body," she declared with quiet fury. "That bear saved Marcus's life twice. If they want to hurt him, they'll have to go through every person in Pine Creek first." Marcus struggled to sit up despite medical protocols and his brother's concerned protests. "We have to stop them. Scar doesn't understand bureaucracy or political maneuvering. He'll try to protect himself the only way he knows how, and they'll use any defensive behavior to justify killing him." Blackwood faced the choice that would define his redemption and his future relationship with his brother. His academic credentials could still influence the Wildlife Authority's decision, but only if he publicly repudiated his previous research and admitted that his entire career had been built on personal trauma rather than scientific objectivity. "I'll call them," Blackwood said quietly. "I'll tell them the truth about everything. About my bias, about Scar's actual behavior, about what really happened in that clearing. My reputation won't survive, but maybe Scar will." The phone call to the Montana Wildlife Authority was brief but explosive. Blackwood's confession that his research had been compromised by personal vendetta sent shockwaves through academic and political circles. His recommendation that Scar be granted protected status based on his documented behavioral sophistication carried weight precisely because it contradicted everything Blackwood had previously argued. Within hours, the capture team was recalled pending a complete review of the case. The decision sparked fierce debate among wildlife officials, with some arguing that Blackwood's change of heart proved the dangerous influence of anthropomorphization, while others recognized the unprecedented nature of Scar's demonstrated intelligence and emotional capacity. The national media coverage shifted from sensational entertainment to serious examination of human-wildlife relationships. Environmental groups rallied around Scar as a symbol of coexistence possibilities, while hunting organizations argued that exceptional cases shouldn't dictate general wildlife management policies. The debate revealed deep cultural divisions about humanity's relationship with the natural world and the role of emotion versus regulation in conservation efforts. Marcus's recovery accelerated as if his body was responding to the resolution of conflicts that had threatened everything he valued. Dr. Martinez noted remarkable improvements in both his physical healing and psychological state, attributing the progress to what she termed purpose-driven recovery. "Your brain is healing because your heart has found peace," she explained during one of their sessions. "The trauma of nearly dying was transformed into the triumph of saving a relationship that matters more than your own safety. That's not just medical recovery, that's spiritual healing." Eleanor organized a welcome home celebration that filled Pine Creek's main street with supporters from around the world. The town that had seemed destined for economic decline was now thriving as a destination for people seeking evidence that love could triumph over fear, that connections could bridge seemingly impossible differences. Frank found himself reluctantly enjoying celebrity status as the veteran whose military metaphors had helped frame Scar's story for mainstream audiences. His interviews on national television brought attention to broader issues of loyalty, honor, and the values that sustain communities through difficult times. The most profound transformation was in Blackwood himself. The academic who had spent decades studying wildlife behavior from a distance now committed himself to understanding the emotional lives of animals through direct observation and interaction. His first paper after the crisis, titled Interspecies Empathy: Reconsidering the Emotional Capacity of Apex Predators, would revolutionize wildlife behavioral science and establish new protocols for studying animal consciousness. As Marcus prepared to leave the hospital, he held his father's compass and thought about the journey that had brought two lost brothers back together through the intervention of a scarred grizzly bear who understood love better than the humans who studied him. The brass needle pointed steadily north, but Marcus knew that true direction came from the heart's ability to recognize connections that transcended species, overcome trauma, and transform enemies into family. The reversal was complete. Hatred had become love, separation had become reunion, and fear had been transformed into wonder at the mysterious bonds that connect all living things. 6 months after what Pine Creek residents now called the miracle in the clearing, Marcus Whitehawk stood at the edge of Scar's territory, watching the morning sun paint the Montana landscape in shades of gold and amber. His walking boot had been replaced by sturdy hiking boots, and the compass around his neck caught the early light like a beacon of hope fulfilled. Beside him, Richard Blackwood adjusted the settings on a camera designed not to exploit, but to document the remarkable relationship that had transformed both their lives. The daily ritual had evolved into something approaching sacred ceremony. Each morning, Marcus would arrive at the clearing where Scar waited with the patience of someone keeping an appointment with destiny. The massive grizzly would approach with the careful deliberation of a friend respecting boundaries while demonstrating unwavering affection. Their exchange of gifts continued, Marcus bringing smooth river stones or interesting branches, Scar reciprocating with pine cones, unusual rocks, or, once memorably, a perfectly preserved bird's nest that he placed with surprising gentleness at Marcus's feet. The neural pathways required for that level of gift selection suggest cognitive complexity we're only beginning to understand, Richard observed, his voice filled with wonder rather than clinical detachment. His academic reputation had indeed suffered from his public confession, but the research emerging from his transformed approach to wildlife behavior was groundbreaking. Universities that had initially questioned his methods were now seeking to replicate his protocols for studying animal emotional intelligence. Eleanor Patterson's diner had become an unlikely pilgrimage destination, its walls now covered with photographs, letters, and artwork from visitors around the world who felt personally connected to Scar's story. The elderly woman who had once worried about having too much love and nowhere to put it now found herself the unofficial mayor of a town transformed by international attention and the economic prosperity that followed. "Honey, I've got a bus tour from Japan arriving at 10, a documentary crew from the BBC at noon, and 3 marriage proposals from widowers who think I'm some kind of love expert," Eleanor announced to Marcus as she packed his usual morning sandwich. "Sometimes I think that bear did more than save your life. He saved this whole town's soul." Frank Morrison had embraced his role as Pine Creek's philosopher in residence, his interviews about loyalty and traditional values resonating with audiences hungry for authentic wisdom in an increasingly complex world. The veteran's crowd-funded memoir, What a Bear Taught Me About Honor, had become a bestseller that donated all proceeds to wildlife conservation and veteran support programs. "Back in my day, we understood that character wasn't about what you said, it was about who you stood with when things got tough," Frank told yet another interviewer. "That bear stood with Marcus when he was dying. Marcus stood with the bear when the bureaucrats wanted him dead. That's the kind of loyalty that built this country, and it's what's going to save it." The legal victory had been more comprehensive than anyone dared hope. Scar's Law, as environmental advocates named it, established new protections for animals demonstrating extraordinary behavioral characteristics or beneficial human relationships. The legislation sparked national debate about wildlife management policies, but its immediate effect was to create a protected sanctuary around Scar's territory that no logging or development interests could violate. The economic transformation of Pine Creek exceeded all projections. Ethical wildlife tourism brought steady revenue that funded improved schools, upgraded healthcare facilities, and infrastructure improvements that benefited longtime residents rather than displacing them. Local businesses thrived serving visitors who came seeking evidence that genuine connection could exist between humans and nature. Marcus had been offered positions with national parks, documentary companies, and conservation organizations, but he chose to remain in the forest where his father had served and where Scar had chosen to make their remarkable friendship visible to the world. His work now combined traditional ranger duties with educational programs that brought school groups to witness the daily meetings between man and bear. "Children understand it immediately," Marcus told a group of educators visiting from urban schools. "They don't bring preconceptions about what's supposed to be impossible. They see love recognizing love across species lines, and they accept it as natural law rather than miraculous exception." The most profound change was in the relationship between the Whitehawk brothers. Richard had sold his house in Missoula and moved to Pine Creek, purchasing a cabin within walking distance of both Marcus's ranger station and Eleanor's diner. The academic who had spent decades avoiding emotional connections now found himself part of an extended family that included a widow who fed everyone, a veteran who dispensed wisdom, and a brother whose friendship with a grizzly bear had healed wounds that time alone couldn't touch. "Dad would have loved this," Richard said as they watched Scar teaching his cubs to approach humans with respectful caution. The young bears showed the same remarkable behavioral patterns as their father, suggesting that peaceful human-wildlife coexistence might be a learnable rather than purely instinctual response. "He did love this," Marcus replied, touching his father's compass. "Everything that's happening now is what he dreamed of. His sons together, the forest protected, people understanding that love is stronger than fear." The scientific community had initially struggled to accept research emerging from what they termed the Pine Creek phenomenon, but the documented evidence was overwhelming. Scar's behavioral sophistication, his offspring's learned responses to human presence, and the measurable positive impacts on local ecosystem health forced a re-evaluation of assumptions about wildlife intelligence and conservation strategies. Dr. Sarah Martinez, now leading a university research team studying human-animal therapeutic relationships, had published groundbreaking papers on what she called interspecies healing. Her work documented how Marcus's recovery from trauma had accelerated through his relationship with Scar, while the bear's own behavioral patterns suggested that the connection provided emotional benefits that traditional wildlife management approaches had never considered. "We're witnessing the emergence of a new paradigm," Dr. Martinez explained to a conference of international wildlife experts. "These relationships aren't anomalies to be managed or eliminated. They're opportunities to understand the deeper emotional lives of species we've historically viewed as purely instinct-driven." The anniversary celebration drew visitors from around the world to Pine Creek, but the intimate core of the gathering remained focused on family. Eleanor had prepared a feast that could have fed twice the actual attendance, while Frank regaled newcomers with stories that grew more colorful with each telling. Richard documented everything with the careful precision of someone preserving sacred moments for future generations. As evening approached, Marcus made his way to the clearing where it all began, carrying his father's compass and a heart full of gratitude for the miraculous chain of events that had transformed trauma into triumph. Scar was waiting, as he had every day for 6 months, his massive presence a living testament to the power of loyalty that transcends species boundaries. The bear approached with familiar gentleness, touching his nose to Marcus's outstretched hand in their customary greeting. Around them, the forest hummed with the quiet sounds of wildlife that had learned to associate human presence with safety rather than threat. Scar's cubs played nearby under their father's watchful eye, demonstrating the same peaceful curiosity about humans that had made their family famous worldwide. "Thank you," Marcus whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was addressing Scar, his father's memory, or the mysterious forces that had woven their lives together in patterns too beautiful to be mere coincidence. "Thank you for teaching us that love doesn't require explanation, only recognition." As the sun set over Glacier Ridge National Forest, painting the sky in colors that matched the hope in Marcus's heart, he thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment of perfect peace. The accident that could have ended his life had instead revealed connections that enriched it beyond measure. The brother he'd lost had been returned transformed by understanding. The community that had seemed destined for decline was now thriving as a beacon of possibility. Eleanor found them there an hour later, Marcus sitting peacefully beside Scar while the bear's cubs investigated the human visitor with careful curiosity. The scene embodied everything she had prayed for during those dark nights when loss seemed to outweigh love. A family reunited, a community restored, and evidence that miracles weren't violations of natural law, but expressions of love's deepest truths. "Lord knows I've seen a lot of beautiful things in my 72 years, Eleanor said softly, "but watching you two together still makes me believe in magic." Frank joined them as darkness settled over the forest, his veteran's eyes bright with unshed tears. "In all my years I've learned that the strongest bonds aren't formed in comfort, they're forged in crisis. That bear chose love when he could have chosen safety. That's the kind of courage that changes the world." As they walked back toward town together, leaving Scar to his peaceful evening routine with his family, Marcus felt the weight of his father's compass against his chest and knew that some journeys end exactly where they're supposed to begin. The forest that had taken his father had given him a brother, a bear, and a purpose that would guide the rest of his days. The story that began with unconsciousness and vulnerability had become a testament to consciousness and strength, proof that love, when authentic and patient, could overcome any obstacle and heal any wound that life created. Dear friends, in a world that often feels divided and cold, Marcus and Scar's story reminds us of something we knew in our hearts but may have forgotten, that love recognizes no boundaries when it's real and true. Like Eleanor, who thought she had too much love and nowhere to put it, many of us carry hearts full of tenderness that the world tells us is old-fashioned or naive. But watching a scarred grizzly bear choose protection over predation, seeing two brothers heal decades of separation, witnessing a small-town rally around what matters most, these moments prove that the values we've cherished our whole lives aren't outdated. They're eternal. Frank's wisdom rings true. That bear shows more loyalty than most people walking around today. In our golden years, when society often makes us feel invisible or irrelevant, this story declares that our capacity for love, our understanding of loyalty, and our belief in miracles aren't signs of weakness. They're gifts this broken world desperately needs. The compass always points toward home, and home is wherever love chooses to make its stand. What moment in your own life proved that love was stronger than fear? Have you ever witnessed an unexpected friendship that changed how you see the world? Share your story in the comments below. Your wisdom matters, and we're listening.